generally speaking, obviously, as people who would call ourselves like wonky people, and I think typically, policy wonks tend to just basically read the evidence and then, to some degree, right, parrot and interpret what the evidence says. You try to build yourself out tools to interpret the evidence, things like this. And so it's difficult to answer the question of, well, what's a policy with a lot of evidence, or a policy stance with a lot of evidence that you just don't agree with, right? That you don't buy the available evidence for various reasons, or perhaps there's an orthodoxy that you disagree with, relative economic consensus that you just don't agree with, right? So that's a difficult one to answer. For this one, I have two things. So I'll start with this one. Number one, when I was thinking about this, term limits immediately came to mind. That was the one that I thought of off the bat. So a lot of people will say, well, there's a lot of these, we've ran this experiment. A lot of states don't have term limits. A lot of states do have term limits for like their state legislators and their governors and things like this. And, we can kind of see, what the impacts are of not having term limits versus having term limits. I don't know, like let's say there's a natural experiment. I'm not saying this is the case, but, Louisiana has term limits for their state legislators, but Mississippi doesn't have term limits, and you can maybe relatively compare the two and see what the outcomes are. And it seems like what the evidence shows, at least like the evidence that you'll read, is that a lack of term limits seems to be worse than having term limits. And what's the explanation for this? Part of the explanation is that the thought is that there's this sort of institutional fragility with a term limited legislature. Right, which is to say that, and you could apply this to presidents and executives as well. There's just less of them, so there's necessarily less data. But of course, it would probably be cross applicable. Like I've never heard somebody say, "I'm against term limits for legislators, but that makes sense for president." Typically, you would group these opinions, and what they'll say is, "Well, because of these term limits, these legislators are inexperienced, and they don't know what the fuck they're doing, right? And they don't know anything about policy, and it takes several years of being in the legislature to understand the sort of goings on of the legislator and all the rules and how to navigate things and the connections that you make, and that you kick these people out after 8 years and they lose all of that, right?" Now, I reject this argument for various reasons. Number one, and also people will say that the less experienced lawmakers are more susceptible to lobbying influence, right? Because they don't know anything, so they have to rely on lobbyists to like tell them how to vote, right? Because they don't know shit. What I would say is, well, number one, lobbying's bad. Right? So just ban it, right? And just fund properly, your political research institutions. After all, we had this whole institutional discussion, several weeks ago where we basically said that, nonpartisan institutions that research policies should be made, much more highly funded, much more credible, and the staffing of legislators should be much more robust. Legislators should be full-time and not part-time in every state. Like no state should have part-time legislators, stuff like that. To where, hopefully we're aligning the incentives in order to get a more professional legislator on the state level. Now, of course, a lot of those things don't apply to federal legislators that don't have necessarily the same constraints. They're full-time employees. They certainly make a full-time salary, and they have some staff, and they have these nonpartisan groups that they can go to. But of course, we could just increase the funding for those as well. And so the evidence of, I put in here the evidence of, oh, well, you're losing experience of your legislators, and this is bad because you lose that institutional knowledge. My response to this, which is going to be pretty simple, is just get good at making policy scrub. Okay, guys, seriously? Oh my goodness, we have to have this fucking 90-year-old dinosaur who literally has won 25 terms in the House because we just can't find anyone else who could possibly have the policy knowledge and experience. Look, I'll tell you this. I have zero experience in a legislator, in a legislative branch. I've never been elected to a legislative branch. Okay, I've never been a congressman. I know a shitload about policy, okay? There's obviously people that exist that know about policy who could be, the wonks of Congress, even in a scenario with, I'm not saying that's me, obviously, but, who could be wonks of Congress in a scenario where we have term limits. And those are kind of the two main arguments that I find, is that, the lack of experience leads to these downstream problems, but I just don't think that it's realistic to really say that term limits are bad because of those things. It's like saying that immigration's bad because it makes housing more expensive. Well, there's probably another issue that's more fundamental. And I would say that there's intrinsic reasons to support term limits, right? So it seems like there is some evidence that term limits create more competitive elections, because you're forcing rotation of offices, so you're forcing people to either leave their office and run for something else, or just opening up those seats for or both, opening up those seats for new people to run for them, which seems to increase turnout. The more competitive elections, the more turnout, and that's generally a good thing. And then number 3, one thing that we pointed to in our institutional episode, something that Micah talked about, where he doesn't even believe in having a president. We should have this council of executives because cults of personality are so bad. Well, what creates a cult of personality more than a guy who's been in office for 50 fucking years, right? This guy who's been in office forever, let's transition him out on a term limit after 8 years and rotate in these people. It gives a lot more opportunity for people to serve in democratic frameworks and democratic institutions, which is good. And I think it does result, ideally, hopefully, in less cults of personality and things like that. Those are my, let's say, intuitive, intrinsic reasons to support term limits for political offices. What are your thoughts, guys?
So I would say that I think that there's a good case for term limits for executive positions where people can build up a lot of power. Like, I think there's, the fact that we have presidential term limits is really good. It's probably protected our institutions. Certainly, there's many cases where we could have had more authoritarian figures in the past. I think for governors, it's a very powerful position, so it might be appropriate. I don't think for legislative positions, the pros outweigh the cons. I think, I just think about city council. Right now, we have city council term limits in the city of Houston of 8 years. There's so many fantastic city council members which would love to stay on, and their constituents would love them to stay on, but they're forced out. And they're not replaced necessarily by higher quality people. In many cases, they're replaced by a lower quality person. So I think that for legislative positions in general, the lobbying, the being prone to lobbying, it is true that by fixing our lobbying issues, that could resolve that concern. But we're not going to fix our lobbying issues, so that certainly is a concern. Experience. This is something that I think matters a lot. Being a politician really is a career. Being a lawmaker, it's kind of unfortunate that that's that the way that you advance in that career is by building up your name ID and so on and so forth. But that's what it's about. If you want to win a political office, you need to be in campaign mode. And people that have been in elected office for a long time don't have to worry so much about the campaign mode, which means they can worry more about the policy. Like people that are young and trying to get into political office, you can't even think about policy at all because you're just trying to increase your name ID and make connections as quickly as possible. So I think that I don't think term limits for legislative positions or really any positions other than executives make sense.
So I think in our discussion on institutional reforms, I would probably agree with Micah and with you, Econoboy, that cults of personality are bad, not a good thing. And that for executive positions, like Micah said, there is a risk of that because that's where more power is built up. And that's also where people have more visibility. Generally, the way we structure it is that there's one executive. And so a lot of focus gets put onto that singular executive. Way more people who know who Joe Biden is. They know how he speaks. They know how he talks. They've listened to him. I bet you, I haven't listened to the voices of every single senator. I bet you that most Americans have only listened to the voices of like 10 senators. And that's just because there's a lot of them, right? You don't have that much time. You don't have the time to look into it all. I think that kind of concern is far less likely in large legislative systems. And those are probably the ones that we should try and emulate in any area that we want to be democratic. So I guess I tend to take the view that the goal of legislative politics is political appointments. Most people aren't. So we talk about like good or bad policy, and it's very hard to measure like how good or bad is the policy of a person in like Congress or whatever. How do you decide whether Ted Cruz's policy is better than like Marjorie Taylor Greene's? I don't know. There's like, what objective metric do you run all that by? It seems sort of impossible to look at that. Instead, I tend to think that the big thing, like the 90% of what we care about, is just people following through on what their constituents want. I tend to think that this is a political decision. Yes, there are people who will be like more thoughtful in their policy, like better in their policy, but 90% of what matters is just the politics of it. And so, insofar as that's actually, in my opinion, that's a weak argument but it does lean in favor actually of term limits of like maybe like 20 years, 15 years, something along that line. Just that incumbents seem to have an advantage insofar as we want to have legislative systems have political choice, that reducing that advantage is probably good. But I would say all of this just seems to be a problem because we have like single member representative districts instead of like PR or a better voting system. So in a better voting system, I don't think that argument would hold bluntly. Like I tend to take the view, you could set a term limit at like 30 years or whatever, just so that no one can control a party forever. But that just wouldn't really matter. I think the average person in Congress has been there for 20 years. It's less than you'd think.
I think you could also maybe make an argument like term limit for whoever's Speaker of the House. Like, it would be bad to have somebody who's the Speaker of the House for like 25 years or something like that.
Yeah, forcing rotation on that seems very useful.
I think that like we're areas where you can concentrate power. But in my view, the longer an elected official is in office, the more political independence they have, the less they actually have to think about political considerations. And I think political considerations in this context are completely perverse. Like you're not thinking about policy at all. You just don't have the energy to. You're thinking about politics. And that
and you're thinking about messaging. Like there's a reason why like so many politicians are optimizing what they're doing in Congress for clips they can get out of C-SPAN or whatever. And that's sort of ridiculous. Like there's actually, funnily enough, some studies which suggest that opening up Congress may have increased performative politics and decreased time spent lawmaking.
I think that's absolutely true. And something else I would say is certainly knowledge goes up over time. Certainly ability to work with other elected officials goes up over time. That's why whenever you see bipartisan legislation that's passed, it's almost always the old people, which are the ones who are able to do it, who have the sufficient connections to do it. So it seems like as elected officials get older and older, they're more capable of doing the job we've sent.
All right, we got to let a Econoboy go.
Yeah. I think the big argument against that though is that so like I think you can permeate these views and say that like I'm not in favor of terms are 1 year and you get a 1-term limit, right? We're just win infinite rotation as much as possible. We have elections every year. Because I would agree, obviously, you want to allow people to basically settle into their role to some degree, right? But some people will have this extreme view. Like, for instance, some of the proposals have been, 5-term limits for Congress people, right? And then, or let's say House of Representatives members, and then 2-term limits for senators, which is to say that you could be in office for 12 years as a senator or 10 years as a member of the House of Representatives, right? And obviously, intuitively, like we've all worked jobs before. And people listening obviously have worked jobs before. If an employee came to me and said, "Hey, boss man, I need literally 28 years of doing this job before I'm competent in it," I'd be like, "Dude, you're probably not the employee for this job," right? And so I think the idea of having some sort of term limit, upper end of saying, hey, and again, we're not saying you can't run for other offices. Maybe at the time of being a congressman for 10 years and you're rotated out, you run for the U.S. Senate. That happens all the time currently. Or you run for governor. Or you can take this experience and apply it to other offices. There's nothing wrong with that under my framework. It's just that, there should probably be some amount of forced rotation that allows you to take advantage of experience. Like, hey, if you've been in office presumably if you've been in this office for 6 years, you're probably pretty damn knowledgeable of what it takes, how to maneuver things, versus like the idea of the utility of like, oh no, we have to have it to where there's some people who've been in this office for 50 years. Like, no, I think there's some serious like diminishing returns in that regard to the value of like legislative experience, right? Like how much more does an 80-year-old person who's been in the office since they were 30 years old, how much more knowledge and experience do they really have versus just big moneyed interest connections compared to the person that's been in there for 8 years? Like, I don't think it's actually that big in terms of institutional knowledge and policy knowledge.
So just 2 thoughts on this. One is that I think that, because people in the House and Senate are very old, we assume they've been there for a long time. The average term in the House is currently around 8 years, and it's been that way for the past 50. And the average term in the Senate is around 12 years, and it's been that way for the past 50. And some of that is literally just because people started living longer. Like the old term used to be death, and we're only really talking about term limits because people are living long enough for it to be a concern. That's my very blunt opinion on it. It's sort of the same problem that we're having with Supreme Court people. Like, it just wasn't a problem that they would live forever when you were in the 1930s. They would just die. You could get a new one pretty quickly. But now they're living 25, 30 years in the seat. That's why it matters. So I think, maybe term limits make sense in a world of very long-lived people. But my second thought on it is, I will actually say, in support of your view, Boy, I think term limits become way more reasonable if you think that we can simplify the business of lawmaking. So, like right now, we have a bicameral legislature that adds a whole layer of complexity that just shouldn't exist. Like you've got the fact that there's different rules for House and the Senate, the fact that there's this whole reconciliation process, the fact that you basically have to go through party leadership to get things through both houses. That's all nonsense. It's all just wasted time. There's literally no benefit to having that bicameral legislature. Similarly, one of the hopes that you'd have is that people would gain expertise in a particular area of expertise in like the House or the Senate. But a lot of people have to serve on multiple committees. So I'm of the view that if you want to maximize this and make term limits as reasonable as possible, you want like a much larger Congress, maybe like 3,000 people. You want no Senate, and you want fairly simple rules for passing laws. And so, like, I don't know, those seem like all fairly progressive things to want as in general. So
yeah, I mean, of course, the of all the institutional reforms I would make, term limits is not the only one. And there's, no matter how you feel about term limits, there's ways to minimize and maximize the potential problems with it. But anyway, how about we move on to the next thing, because we've been talking about term limits for a little while now. The next thing that I was going to talk about, and we can talk about this briefly, is so policies that have a lot of evidence that I have a little bit of skepticism is quantitative easing. Now, this is a bit of a cheater policy. Wasn't sure if I was going to bring this up because the actual evidence on quantitative easing is somewhat mixed. The reason I still put it up there is because so many central banks have decided that this is just like a thing that we're going to do. I'm very skeptical of it. Like, I've become much more skeptical of quantitative easing over time. So for those that don't know, quantitative easing is a practice of the central bank in many, many different countries, where essentially what these banks do is they electronically create cash and then they buy things with it, right? So some central banks, like the American Central Bank, you'll electronically create cash, give it to asset holders who hold debt instruments. That's kind of what we decided. We only buy debt with quantitative easing. We'll buy government treasuries that people have. We'll buy MBSs, mortgage-backed securities. We'll buy corporate bond portfolios, stuff like that. Central banks like Japan have been a little bit more expansive, where they'll actually buy like business ownership. They'll buy corporate equities and things like this as well. I'm very skeptical of this policy for a number of reasons. I think that this policy sort of was created, or at least like largely implemented, in response to the financial crisis of 2008. And part of the logic of this policy, I think, was, well, we've got these sort of these overvalued, let's say, securities. There's a bubble that was created because of all these different problems in the credit market. So we're going to come in and inject cash and buy these assets and prop up the value. That way, our financialized system doesn't just like completely collapse. Now, the question is, does this actually like help the system though? Right? Like, that's one thing that I'm just not sure that I'm sold on yet. It wasn't clear that the actual goal of quantitative easing in 2008, which was to create inflation, actually worked. What it did do in 2008 and in 2020 was create a lot of asset price inflation. But does that really like trickle down, quote unquote, into sort of like real productive activity, or does it just result in like inflated wealth for the people at the top? And does this actually hurt like efficient market allocation? Like, that's something that like even the libertarian will say is like, well, hey, when you've got the government just like spending trillions of dollars into these asset markets, is that even something that we want? Like, do we want the government to just be able to inject trillions of dollars into asset markets basically whenever they want? Because that's what, essentially they've done over the last several decades. And it's not clear to what effect it's really had in terms of true economic growth versus, again, just sort of inflating wealth and income inequality. And it also creates another criticism of like, well, should our system even be so financialized, right? For instance, I think a lot of YIMBYs who talk about housing, and a lot of this like very disproportionately affects the housing market, is that I think transitively with a lot of YIMBY arguments, you're arguing for less financialization of housing by making the sort of raw cost of housing much lower, right? So necessarily your reliance on things like mortgages would be a lot less lower on the margin. And then a lot of YIMBYs like me would also advocate for a lot of non-market housing as well, public housing and investments, which of course, you don't really take out a mortgage to, live in, a public apartment complex or something like that, right? And so, yeah, I'm very skeptical of it. A lot of central banks have decided to do it. The actual like evidence on it is mixed, to be fair, but I feel like it just probably might not be good. Let's say I'm very skeptical of it. Let's say at the very least, and at the very, very least, fiscal institutions should be better, we were just talking about that earlier. That's what I said we were talking about in quantitative easing section, is our fiscal institutions should be better such that we don't need to inject trillions of dollars into asset markets to stabilize our economy. Like, in general, that's probably a bad thing, that I would say. So what do you guys think?
So I think that first, I think quantitative easing in the debate regarding is one of the more confusing areas of economics. Macroeconomics writ large is like pretty confusing because like there's a bunch of really intelligent people which spend their entire life studying a subject and completely disagree on like every element of every single thing. Sometimes they even disagree about what they're disagreeing about. It's kind of like philosophy. And so I'd say that my view on quantitative easing is like, I just can't imagine that it doesn't do anything because I think it leads to some absurd conclusions, right? So if you think that the government or the central bank can just acquire a bunch of assets and that doesn't really affect the demand reflected in the economy almost at all, well, that just means we could do socialism and it's not a big deal at all. I mean, like, we don't need a tax to fund our social wealth fund. Like, we could just have the central bank just acquire all those assets. No big deal at all, right? And that's great. Honestly, I hope that's, if that's true, then oh my God, social wealth fund socialism became the most feasible idea on the entire planet. I'm not sure if that's correct, though. It seems to me that if you, are injecting a bunch of newly created money to buy these assets, first, the assets are increasing in value, which has wealth effects on the consumption of the asset holders. Second, the people who are actually selling the assets and receiving the newly created money, their income, like their actual amount of cash they have, that has increased. And third, you've allowed firms to raise more money via equity releases because now those assets will be valued more, which means that it's now cheaper to finance capital expenditures if you're a firm by releasing equity. So
Micah, just to ask on that, like, if the arguments for what QE does is basically that it increases wealth and it increases access to finances, then would that not also occur so basically my two concerns were, one, isn't it an increase of wealth of like the very, very, very top people in society who tend to have very different consumption patterns? If our goal is to increase demand, then wouldn't doing like the QE of just giving people money that you've like printed out of thin air have a larger demand effect?
Yeah. So if the question about QE is not whether it's effective, but rather whether it's ideal,
sure,
then I certainly would say it's probably not ideal.
Sure.
Now, like, actually, honestly, it should be you probably that's more arguing for QE than me, because the benefit of QE is, yes, the inequality effect isn't as great, but I suppose in the long term, the wealth equality effect is actually pretty positive because the government's adding assets to its balance sheet. But certainly, if the goal is just efficiently increasing demand, sending checks to everybody is very efficient. And it's super direct. Like, if the Japanese central bank had just decided, instead of buying all these assets and doing all these negative interest rates and crazy financial strategies, they just decided, hey, we're just going to print a bunch of money and send it to everybody, their deflation concerns would have been gone very, very quickly.
Well, that's sort of what I was trying to bring up, is that I think Econoboy was trying to argue that there's more of a shift away from focusing on financial markets and manipulating those and then hoping they have effect on the real economy, and trying to argue for like big fiscal approaches where you just affect the real economy and assume that will reflect in the financial one. Is that a fair summary of what you're trying to get at, Econoboy?
Yeah, like I'm not, it wouldn't, of course I'm not, I wouldn't be surprised, and the evidence seems to reflect that obviously quantitative easing has some effect, right? Like it's clear that the quantitative easing has an economic effect. I mean, it would be completely idiotic to
a lot of people
otherwise.
Argue it doesn't. It's a surprising number,
yeah,
actually.
Obviously, if the government does almost anything with trillions of dollars, it's going to have some amount of an effect, of course, but that's the thing, like, is the effect like sort of like what we would call like true economic productive activity and productive investment, or is it basically just asset price inflation and an increase in wealth inequality? Like, that's kind of what I would worry about, is like the most of the effect of asset price inflation. Because, for instance, if we were to say, well, if we just cut taxes to the rich, then they're going to engage in all this more productive activity. They're going to invest more, and they're going to start new companies, and they're going to take on more debt and take on more risk, and that'll stimulate the economy. I think pretty much every economist who, with any credibility, says that's stupid. That's the old way of doing things. We don't do that anymore. We know that doesn't work. But for some reason, if the central bank does functionally the exact same thing and gives away trillions of dollars to people who very disproportionately are wealthy, large corporations, large banks, large asset holders, these are all extremely wealthy people, and says, well, we expect that this will stimulate lending activity, this will stimulate equity investment, all of a sudden for some reason our brains just don't combine those two narratives and say, well, that's obviously ridiculous, right? Like that doesn't seem to happen. And in terms of what, and it's hard to say because these policies are happening concurrently. Like for instance, in 2020, could we really say, well, what really had the better effect of bringing us out of the recession? Was it the trillions of dollars of QE, or was it the trillions of dollars of fiscal spending? Like we did both. I mean, who's to really say? But intuitively, like from a sort of more classical Keynesian perspective, I would say it's almost certainly the fiscal investments, because those are more, you could say like direct, like middle out, lower income, like targeted investments versus these basically inflating asset prices, right? So.
Yeah, I think that Q is certainly a bigger deal than V. So that's like my concern with fiscal policy and its efficacy. I don't know how big of a deal velocity is. I don't know how big of a deal government spending decisions has on like the velocity of money, how quickly it moves between hands, because that's the mechanism by which economic stimulus works. But I would agree that the financial route that we've traditionally taken with our monetary policy, where we basically say, hey, central bank, yes, you have control of the money supply, but you have to basically control it exclusively through toying with financial markets, is clearly not the most efficient way to mess with the quantity of money. Now, I think that we've done that for just pragmatic institutional reasons, right? We wanted to give them their own domain where we could just like really say, okay, go hog wild, do whatever the hell you want, right? There may be concerns with giving the central bank the ability to directly tax people, like have a variable VAT, raises sales taxes on everybody, and sending checks to people. I think it's a pragmatic concern, not so much like a good theoretical reason why they've been constrained to financial tools.
All right, last thing, SDL, and then we'll move on to one of you guys' policies with a lot of evidence that you're skeptical in.
I was listening to Mike talking about the VAT rates, and I totally lost what it was.
Well, he was talking about if the Fed could just directly give cash to people, or jack up their taxes.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have anything to add beyond like there's political concerns there too, that like, if you give people the print stimulus checks to people button and then you tie it to a political incentive, then like a lot of them will just do that. And so that has bad political incentives. So that raises concerns about how independent the Fed can be. And so there's just a whole problem there.
Well, exactly. And again, I wish that these conversations were linked, right? Because, people might say, well, we can't just give the government a print money and give it to people button, but we do the same thing for a print money and give it to banks button, right? So yeah. It's all to say that I wouldn't be surprised if we could divine the truth of the effects of quantitative easing and say, yeah, quantitative easing has some positive effects here and there, like there's some trade-offs. I'm just generally skeptical of like the degree to which we rely on it, especially today. You might argue that there were specific reasons why quantitative easing was appropriate during like the financial recession, or even during the lockdown sort of induced recession of 2020, because it's almost like these were like bubbles or like specifically a financial recession, or this sort of imposed recession of people, that maybe quantitative easing was more appropriate. But I'll be interested to see if we just have sort of a demand, if we just have like sort of a generic demand glut recession. I'm curious to see if we'll do quantitative easing, because almost certainly quantitative easing would be bad to do in a scenario like that.
And just to close it off and add one more reason why our current instruments are not necessarily great, they're very asymmetric in the way they impact demand, right? So like whenever you lower interest rates, that helps the housing market, and it takes a long time for those dollars to get to those other markets. Yeah. Which, that's just not a good way to combat, recessions, which many times have very diffuse effects on demand all across the economy.
I remembered what I wanted to say, Micah. You were just talking about the effect of government spending on velocity of money, and this is not directly related. So I've been having a lot of debates with Austrians on Twitter recently. Oh, God. And so one of the central theories in a lot of Austrian economics is their business cycle, which relates to the lengthening and shortening of the business cycle. If I try and say it on the fly, I'm going to mangle which way the terms go, but it's something like, as inflation goes up, that shortens the business cycle. As inflation goes down, that lengthens the business cycle. So Basically, the argument goes that a lot of government spending and government programs artificially adjust the business cycle to be too long or too short. And I'm sorry, business structure, to be clear, to be too long or too short. So by that, they mean that you have like firms which are producing something in a longer production process. And so they argue this has effects on time impacts of money. And I just wanted like the empirical research on does government spending, do inflation rates, do interest rates seem to affect like how long production processes are? The effect is like very, very close to zero. Like in fact, in one of the studies, it was the opposite of what the ABCT predicted. So that like, in fact, the government policies tended to slightly elongate production processes, but again, not statistically significantly. So it's just like, that's not the mechanism by which you should be trying to decide how to run an economy. So.
Alrighty. Micah, let's go over to you. What's a policy that, has a lot of evidence behind it, but you just don't buy it for various reasons?
So I'd say probably the best one of the ones I listed down here was all-payer rate setting. To give some context, the all-payer rate setting relates to how insurance sets the reimbursement rates for providers, right? So like you're a healthcare provider, right? You're a physician providing just a general checkup. How much should you get paid, right? In the United States, we have different private insurers which privately negotiate with different private providers how much each physician is going to get paid for a certain kind of service, right? And this system doesn't work very well. It seems like there's a huge consensus of health researchers that the kind of prices you get negotiated for goods and services in healthcare markets like the United States are really irrational. They vary a lot. There's really famous stories of like an MRI costing $9,000 on one block and then $2,000 on another block. Huge price differences, not at all justified by any sort of like good economic reasoning, and largely because of these private negotiations themselves are very administratively costly because they have to take place between each private provider and each private insurer that they take. They can distort decisions. They're just really bad, and so most countries that are advanced have a policy in place called all-payer rate setting, where there is some sort of central negotiation of the reimbursement rates for different types of goods and services in the healthcare industry. So for instance, in a country like Germany, they may set it federally that a physician will get paid such and such amount of dollars by insurers for this kind of visit. It's like one centralized fee schedule, and this reduces administrative costs a lot. And this is often thought as a good policy to put in place in the United States. I don't disagree that this kind of policy would probably be better than what we have presently, but I do have concerns that it's not ideal and it could have some negative consequences. One of the negative consequences it would have is by standardizing prices across the board, you don't allow price competition, which is really important, right? So, if I am a physician or I'm a firm and I find a much more efficient way to deliver maybe a specific type of service, I can't undercut competitors because ultimately the insurance is providing one reimbursement rate. And so I can't increase my market share very rapidly and therefore push other firms and healthcare providers to utilize that same technology. We see this is likely the case even under the current system as well, but all across the world. Healthcare innovation is relatively slow in places that really rely on insurance compensation to providers for these services because there's just not very much price competition. And when there's not price competition, innovation just generally doesn't happen. Now, in Singapore, they allow people to basically shop around for elective surgeries, and I think even non-elective surgeries. So if you want to get a knee replacement, there's like a database, and you can look at the costs at the different hospitals in Singapore for that knee replacement. And that price competition, I think, is fantastic. And so I would say that there's a lot of evidence and health economists that are in favor of all-payer rate setting. I would agree that it's probably better than the status quo, but I'd say that there's this more novel system, which we've seen some success with, in other countries and also within plastic surgery in the United States that I think would be better than that policy.
Yeah, I think this is a matter of like how much how do I put this? Like how much creative destruction and how much innovation do you think we really like? How much innovation do we really get from like the private for-profit healthcare market? Whereas like a lot of socialists will say, well, really, almost all of that innovation could be replicated with public dollars and sort of socialized consumption. Whereas obviously you're taking the more pro-market stance where you're saying like, no, there's like definitely like a novel contribution to healthcare innovation with these private actors. I would draw an analogy to the pharmaceutical industry, where it seems sort of almost like trivially obvious when you look at pharmaceutical innovation research, where it seems like public and private dollars accomplish novel, different things, right? Whereas a lot of public dollars in pharmaceutical research has utility because of the sort of decommodified aspect of it, and it's not necessarily for-profit in nature. A lot of those dollars can go towards niche, novel treatments. A lot of times those dollars can go towards treatments that aren't necessarily profitable, but certainly matter a lot to a lot of people. Whereas, and you see this also in a lot of the literature on public investment in general, where public investment is oftentimes very good at providing novel innovations, but in terms of improving and sort of systematizing and making much more efficient the innovations that currently exist, private investment tends to be a lot better at that. And that's what you see in the pharmaceutical research as well, where private investment tends to make current known treatments a lot better, right? So, Micah, like you'll use diabetes medication as an example of this, where like we've got like this sort of general understanding of how to treat diabetes, and private investors will make the current treatments of diabetes way better, right? Because that's a very profitable thing to do, right? Because there's a lot of people with diabetes. There's a lot more people in the future that are going to get diabetes, and there's no cure for diabetes. Whereas the government might be conversely able to sink billions of dollars into like an actual cure for diabetes, and there's some plug and play here. And I'm sure it's the same with medical innovations as well. I guess the question would be, in my view, what in your view, like what's the best way to control costs then in a world where you feel like private innovation and private spending provides utility, right? Like what is the best way to control costs? Yeah.
So I think that market-based pricing and downward pressure on prices placed by market forces will be really good for the kind of shoppable services and goods that I'm talking about, right? Some things are not shoppable, right? Like if you're hit by a car and you need to go to the emergency room, you're not going to, there's no shopping mechanism. I don't care what libertarians tell you. There's not sufficient market forces. So you just need to regulate those prices a lot. For shoppables, what you do basically is you have an insurance policy like Medicare provided to everybody. And you basically say, hey, for a knee replacement, we have a budget. Basically, the government will pay 90% of the cost of the knee replacement up to some benchmark amount, right? And it'll be like, what the government praises to be the reasonable cost, right? So up to like $30,000 or whatever, we will pay 90%. And hey, shop around, right? If you get one that's cheaper than the $30,000, hey, you just save some money because you're on the hook for 10%. And if you want to get a really, really nice knee replacement, let's say it's a new technology and it's really worth it, it's going to give you some cybernetic knees. Okay, you can pay more than the $30,000. You're just going to have to pay the entire difference between that $30,000 and that amount. So I think that worked pretty well. That's what they use in Singapore. And I'd also note that it's not just Singapore which is the evidence point for this. We've seen that in plastic surgery, there really has been just a huge difference in the price movements of plastic surgery procedures and surgeries relative to insurance covered procedures and surgeries. Like inflation adjusted prices for many plastic surgery procedures have just fallen over time. That's despite the fact that we see that plastic surgeons, their wages are going up at the same rate as other types of surgeons. They're exposed to what we call cost disease and the Baumol effect, these kind of things. But we've just seen like these technological enhancements in plastic surgery because of this price competition that you have not seen in the rest of the healthcare industry.
So I just wanted to speak to that tiny bit because plastic surgery is in many senses like the places you'd expect the healthcare market to work the best because people have the most elastic demand. They can choose not to get it most of the time. So an example is like LASIK. You can just get glasses instead. There's a lot of other substitutable goods. If you don't get LASIK now, you can get it in the future. For a lot of other healthcare goods, you have a lot more time-sensitive demand. Like if your stomach is killing you, you need to get it fixed now. And so there's just a lot of things that you do not have the ability to shop around. I know even in LASIK, it was surprising. I read a study of LASIK consumers, which found that 98% do not shop around, which is, if you look at like people shopping on Amazon, it's going to be a much higher rate of people who compare different prices. But like, the plastic surgery market, I'm just trying to point to it, is like the best possible case for markets in healthcare. And I'm just not sure that it's reasonable to look to that and draw analogies for the general healthcare market, which comes closer to like relatively inelastic goods where it's not easy to get a lot of information. And I would also just note, it's sort of an odd thing, but a lot of plastic surgery is less invasive than a lot of non-plastic surgery. So it's possible that some of the technical innovation is just because the type of surgery it offers is different, that like mechanically there's something different.
So I think that you're correct in the sense that plastic surgery markets are not necessarily illustrative of like a perfectly functional.
Oh, Micah, you cut out. Your mic's gone. You're back.
Plastic surgery markets are not operating probably even near optimality in the United States because there's so much information issues, right? How do I compare the prices? Like, what are all these websites? What are all these procedures, right? Even for a lot of elective surgeries, but you still have to pay out of pocket for them. Like let's say bunion procedures. Do I want to get an Austin bunionectomy? Do I want this new non-invasive procedure for my bunion? Like which procedure? I don't know. Right? I'm just a normal consumer, right? So I think that ideally, in the system that I'm proposing, it would be more similar to the Singaporean use. Tons of transparency, standardization. Across the board. I think the government should actually probably have standards where we force people to implement the best procedures and like reduce the amount of variety of procedures to address a certain issue. We have like maybe quality ratings, like so that there's it's like a marketplace, just like the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, where you just go to a database and you're like, okay, I want to get this procedure, bam, and you can look and really compare them, and it's simplified and easy to compare.
Well,
I think that
it sounds like if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying, Mike, is it's almost like let's say that, I don't know, like, let's say that I like you use the example of a knee replacement, I need a knee replacement. And let's say that there's what the government determines as like a basic knee replacement with like basic sort of proven methodology. The government will cover, the whole cost of that, will cover $25,000 or like whatever the cost is. Right. But then there's like Mr. Crazily good knee surgeon with this new innovative technique that he charges $45,000 for, and the government says we'll cover the $25,000, but you're on the hook for the other $20,000 if you want like boutique surgeries or medications and things like this. Yeah.
And if you get one that's cheaper, the government's going to give you a little bit of difference, right? So like there's probably going to be some co-insurance, like a little bit of cost sharing. And so you basically get to save on that amount. If you want no cost sharing, where the government just pays like, the $25,000 for the procedure, we could like credit some of it back. So if you if you get a good deal, it's only $20,000 instead of $25,000, we're going to give you 10% of the savings, or like something like that. I think that's pretty reasonable. Now, as was said previously, I don't think that, like specific things like general practitioners, like primary care, might not work with this kind of model. But you could also have price competition there, right? So you could basically have it where all primary care physicians charge you a monthly subscription amount. This is what happens with a lot of direct primary care providers, which are very common in the state of Texas. So instead of you being charged a fee for every time you see them, they charge you like $80 a month or $100 a month. And the government says, hey, we'll pay the $100 a month. If you get one that's cheaper, we'll give you a little bit of savings. If you get one that's more expensive, you have to pay the difference. I think that's a really good idea because you can consider that this could allow a lot of kind of innovative delivery systems, which are not currently which don't really make so much sense in the current system, that could make sense in this system. Go ahead.
Well, it feels like stuff like primary care is going to be so, what is the innovation that's going to occur that's going to like let you escape the Baumol-Cost disease, bluntly? Because it feels like so much of the cost of a surgery is that you also go ahead.
Automation.
Of what?
Healthcare
of office
pods.
staff?
Yeah, healthcare pods. I think that like AI doctors is like totally the future. Like,
if you're gonna talk about AI doctors, then you might not even need to go into the office, or like I don't know, that feels like a totally different model. But I'm saying that's a totally different model than like the primary care model, right? Like it's.
Well, I think under Micah's proposal, you might eventually, like, for instance, if we innovate sufficiently to where primary care can be totally automated by AI, well, maybe the government does just completely take that over and like offer it to everyone because now the innovation exists, right? Like,
well, but Micah would argue that some AI companies can offer it cheaper, and like that's where the price, you only want to pay 90% of it so that they can compete on the other 20%, and that drives prices down.
Like I can imagine like Amazon comes around, they're like, oh, okay, we want to get into healthcare now. We're going to open these healthcare pods where you can just come in and get like your analysis done really quickly. There's like not even a doctor there. It's like, we're super high tech. Look at all these gizmos.
What I'm trying to get is like imagining a world where AI diagnosis is not possible, just for the sake of argument. Like imagine we were arguing this policy in 1970 or whatever. What innovations would we be wanting to see in healthcare that we would not be seeing because we did not have price competition? Like where have there been innovative primary care models which significantly reduced costs?
Well, I mean, you see right now, direct primary care providers provide, it seems like, a much better service than traditional primary care. So in many ways.
So, I mean, I have looked into some of the research on this. Like the literature reviews on direct primary care seem to say that there just isn't good evidence to compare quality, that like they're rare enough and the types of people they tend to serve are different enough that it's very hard to compare them, like one DPC system to another or one DPC system to a non-DPC system. And so go ahead.
Well, here's what I would say. I'd say first, in many cases, the actual cost of being one of them, when you compare like the actual cost you pay versus the cost your insurance would pay, like holding the real total compensation provided to them per patient is just different. Like that, per pay, it seems like the DPC might be providing a much cheaper service. Many times they provide a more expansive array of services, right? So you can call them anytime. You can have same-day visits, right? You can send them emails. We see that the satisfaction rates amongst these physicians is much, much, much higher. And that's something that's important too. They really, like almost everybody that switched from being a traditional physician to being a DPC physician has said they like it more. And there's been a poll, I think, of physicians which are not in DPCs, and they've said, man, I really like what they're doing. I wish I could do it as well, right? So like, it seems like this is a business model which there's room for that price competition to actually generate maybe more efficient uses of data, more efficient handling of staff, right? Like maybe we need less admin staff. There's more automations for our business. We don't need a secretary in the front. Seems like there's plenty of ways in which that price competition could actually lead to something.
Sure, but let me put it to you like this. It's not clear why some of those things would not also occur. So like in the alternative where you have like the same rate you pay for the same service, right? It's not clear why you wouldn't also want to get rid of secretaries in that model, right?
Well, so this is, you are potentially more neoclassical than I am, because you might think that firms are full of rational actors which maximize profits. I think that you have to really hold their feet to the fire, and that competition is what forces them to use new technologies and use more efficient procedures or go out of business. I think that's very important.
But sure, but I'm trying to. How does that not occur in the alternate model, right? Like, is there not still a profit incentive to do so, and that those firms will rise and others will?
There's not a survival incentive.
How would the 90% subsidy? I'm just taking, like, imagine the 90% subsidy exists. How would that cause a survival incentive? But the same rate for same service would not cause a survival incentive. There'd be some firms which would be charging above that, and they would die, right? Like their cost of production would be too high. And if you imagine the government is just lowering that cost over time, they're trying to force it down as low as possible. Why would the similar experience not occur? They're essentially forcing firms to compete on lowering the cost of services provided.
Well, I mean, obviously the government arbitrarily lowering it, certainly could have concerns where it could lower it too much and just put.
Well, I agree, but I'm trying to say, like, the 90% model is essentially saying the market will naturally lower it, and those firms which are too high, they'll fall out of business, right? They won't survive. But so the question is, why not just do that by the state.
Well, but
Micah,
there's a
last
big
word on
difference.
this before we move on
Sorry,
to
yeah,
SDL's
my bad.
policy.
Well, I mean, there's a difference in the sense that if the government lowers it too much, in the case of there's still some cost sharing under this, it's in like internal reference-based pricing model. We can compensate. Okay, we're just going to pay a little bit more out of pocket because you just set the compensation rate too low. If the government's doing price controls, where it's just saying, okay, we're going to keep lowering the price. This is the way that we're going to make everything cheaper. We're just going to lower the price every year. Well, guess what? They might just lower it way too much, and you're going to have a really big supply shortage, right? Like we wouldn't apply like price controls and lowering the price each year to like any other good and think that would be a good cost containment.
I agree that you would have to be more
SDL,
complicated.
I said.
I agree. It'd have to be more
Micah got the
complicated.
last word. Come on. All right. Next up, let's talk about SDL's policy. That the evidence seems to back it, but he is skeptical of it for various socialist reasons.
So I will give some of the same caveat that you gave, Econoboy. I don't know that there's actually great evidence for this policy so much as it seems to be an incredibly, incredibly popular policy across the United States. It's that of local elections and elected judges. I'm increasingly convinced that we just shouldn't have local elections. And I mean that in a very broad sense. Like, if you're going to have a board of elections, it should be an enormous thing, like for a huge region. If you're going to have a judge election or whatever, it should be very, very high up. You shouldn't have like local city elections as much as possible. I'm very convinced, and not based on a lot of evidence, which is why I put it here. There's some suggestive evidence that local elections tend to be disproportionately biased towards like the older, the richer, those with more time. A lot of biases which tend to make policy, in my opinion, worse, but also in a real sense less democratic, right? The people who most benefit from policy, the people who are like most marginal, are the least able to have a voice in local policy. That is the opposite in either direct democracy or in larger representative systems, or if you mandate voting. So two sort of suggestions here. One is it's just sort of getting rid of local elections would be my first sort of suggestion. That you shouldn't elect your local cop. You shouldn't elect your local city council. It should all be bigger.
Like merge it with the county. Is that the idea?
So I would say even bigger. Like I imagine a world where so some states are a little too big, but we have central governments in Europe that administer like 6 million people centrally down without a lot of local governance. We could do that here. We have 6 million person states.
I don't know about that.
I was going to say, I think it's a matter of, there's obviously, how do I put this? There's obviously a utility to technocratic sort of institutions, right? I mean, it's very rare that somebody would argue for democratically electing like the engineer who designs the bridge, right? Because that probably wouldn't work out too well. It's probably better just to have city administration just hire that person and go through a standard screening process. Now, at the same time, I think the question is like, well, could there be some sort of like technocratic democracy that you could implement as well? Like, for instance, for elected judges, weirdly enough, sometimes for elected judges, you don't even have to be a lawyer. Like sometimes it's just like anybody can be a judge, which is pretty crazy. But in a world where you have elected judges and you have sort of technocratic requirements, which is oftentimes the case, right? Where like, hey, if you're going to run for an elected judge position, you have to be a lawyer. You might have to have so many years of experience. You might have to have practiced in a certain area of law. I think that becomes a lot more defensible. Like maybe you can have technocratic elections like, hey, the guy who's going to design the bridge has to have a civil engineering degree, has to have so many years of experience working at a certain kind of firm. This kind of thing could make sense. What do you think about that, SDL?
So to cheat a little bit, elected judges is probably the area where I have done more research. And the research there seems to be pretty negative, that like there's virtually no area where elected judges seem to be better, as far as I can tell, than appointed judges by like the state legislature in basically every United States state. So elected judges tend to be more punitive in their crimes. They tend to respond to that punitiveness in election years, but not in non-election years. One of the really neat studies of this is that, say that the term is like 4 years. Every 4 years you get reelected. Well, in those years, judges have harsher sentences, but not on the year they retire. So it's like, well, that seems like really shit. I don't want people making bad policy decisions. And this is a real policy decision. Every criminal sentence they hand out is a policy decision of how harshly should we punish this, that, or the other. I don't want that to be decided by how much a guy wants to win re-election by appealing to the dumbest people on earth. So I feel like I will say, in defense of what you said, there has been some evidence in that that nonpartisan legislative appointed elections seem to have no difference than just straight up appointed ones. So you still might be able to unelect people, but I'll just say that the re-election rates for those judges are like very, very, very high. It is very unoften the state legislature appoints someone and then the voters are like, no, we absolutely despise this person. We don't even know what his party is, but he's got to go. It's like recall elections. They're very, very rare.
Yeah, so I think elected judges it's a pretty awful system. I think that I mean, specifically in the case of Houston, we had one of our judges of the year. He lost his Democratic primary. Like literally, like extremely popular judge. Everybody loves him.
Clearly not popular enough, Micah.
Well, like, you know, the voters have no idea who these people are, and you see this with city local elections all the time. People show up to vote based on maybe one or two people they know, maybe the mayoral candidates. Right, and then they vote largely just showcasing their prejudices. So there's huge biases you see based on name. It's just like it's a really big factor: perceived gender, perceived race, and like that's an awful way to determine who ends up becoming an elected official. Now, I would say though, the argument against having appointed judges is practical in many states like Texas, where that means that Republicans, particularly insane Republicans, will appoint everybody. Which, if that's the alternative, then that might be worse. That seems worse.
I will say the obvious suggestion here in a very politically polarized climate is the same thing you'd want to try and do with the Supreme Court. You'd want to have it be some kind of ranked choice voting system or something along those lines, where if you control 50% of the legislature, you get 50% of the judges, and the minority party, they only have 40%, so they only get 40% of the judges.
Single transferable vote, like proportional appointment. I think that
and so you still get insane judges. It's just a proportional insane judge system.
Well, you could also have like counties appoint judges to state courts. So I will say, you know, I'm of the opinion that maybe it seems like one of the effective sizes for a lot of legislatures is on the order of like 500,000 to 5 million or something. It seems like when you get larger, there do seem to be issues where with very large systems, and there also seem to be issues with small systems. And so if you had something larger than a county, because a lot of counties aren't 500,000 people, but if you had like a region of Texas appointing judges, maybe. I'm essentially supposing like a regional legislature. There should be another layer of federalism, above the local and below the state. I guess it's weird because I'm in Harris County, which is 4.7 million people. So
you're one of the exceptions.
I suppose that's the case. I mean, ideally, we probably just split the states into like 4 million people bunches.
In my opinion, the states should be much smaller. Like literally, you should just be reassigning the states, and that has whole problems with other economic policy. But like, at least for stuff like voting, like these sort of judge decisions, you should probably be having a lot more like fluid borders of states over time.
We would have like Chinese style addresses under STL. We'd have like you're from District 1 of Region 4. And it's like, oh, okay.
That's right.
No, I was gonna say that I think as well, like I think a lot of people will fall into the criticism of this and they'll say, well, that's obviously anti-democratic, right? Because it's almost like you're necessarily arguing for a less, obviously you're arguing for less democracy in a world where it's administered, but really what you're arguing for, and where I would kind of bisect the conversation, is that ultimately the regulation of these systems is always going to be democratically managed, right? You're always going to elect your city council members who, or your county boards or your federal legislators or whoever, and they're going to ultimately be the ones who are charged with, essentially regulating how we do law and justice in the country. At least like that would be my model. But there's a difference between saying the regulators are all elected and also the management of these systems has to be elected as well. That's a big difference, right? Because we might all say that we should have a publicly funded and publicly owned and operated police force, and that might be regulated by a mostly civilian, legislator. Obviously, maybe military veterans run for the legislator, but it's essentially a civilian legislator who's regulating that entity. But that's different from saying that the chief of police needs to be directly democratically elected as well, right? Because that probably doesn't matter. Yeah.
There's a difference between overall democracy and direct election of it. It's sort of a similar argument to direct versus indirect democracy. There do seem to be some areas where direct democracy biases people. So there's some studies that like when you put to vote things on crime or civil rights, people are way worse in direct democracy than indirect democracy, which is probably mostly a function of legislators being like going to college and being slightly more liberal and open-minded, bluntly, than the average voter. So I don't tend to think it's because legislators are like God kings or philosopher kings. I will say, Economo, you should check the YouTube chat. An event occurred.
An event occurred? Oh, no.
Yeah, I got to be vague about it so you can announce it when you see it and you're happy.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, Pondering Politics, our first super chat. I don't know. Oh, yeah, I guess it didn't show up on the screen. Getting my brains wonked out right now, says Pondering Poly. There we go. It showed up on this. I don't know why. Donations show up like super delayed on my thing for some reason. But Pondering Politics, friend of 3 wonks, regular viewer, donates $50. Thank you so much. Getting my brains wonked out right now. Well, thank you so much, Pondering Politics. That means
thank you so much for the impressively generous donation, Pondering Politics. We are going to wonk those brains out all night long.
We do have to
collab. Wins the collab.
At some point closer to the election, we do need to have Pondering Politics on a 3 Wonks episode just to have a more political discussion. That'll be interesting. But no, thanks for watching Pondering Politics. But no, yeah, I think that's fair. And it does seem weird because there are a lot of empirical examples of like ostensibly progressive voters going like total goblin mode on certain issues. Like the most famous example is California voting to ban gay marriage in like 2003.
Well, that's one of the examples I was citing for civil rights is that, like, compared to the legislators, the voters were slightly more conservative on gay marriage. And that seems to be a systematic thing across direct democracy, that when you give voters a chance to be, like, socially conservative on race, immigration, like civil rights, at least in America, they will pick it. And since I care a lot about those, I think, probably abstracting away from that is probably for the best. So...
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's just a matter of your manager, like for instance, your judges are ultimately accountable to the legislator, right? If a judge can be impeached, the way that judges get selected can be reformed. But do we trust that the management of this, because there's so many stories, like how do I put this? I don't think I've ever heard a story of an appointed judge just not showing up to work. I don't think I've ever heard that before. But there's like so many news stories of, local elected judge just doesn't do their job. Just like never shows up to work, doesn't give a shit, like just gets reelected. And it's like, well, obviously that's not good, right? So.
Well, and just to speak to what Micah was talking about, there's some concerns that stuff like this means less democracy. And I tend to take the opposite view. I think that democracy means giving voters an informed choice between policy options. And when people don't have information or the policy options aren't clear, that's not really democracy. It's like what Micah says. You're often just basing this on biases based on name or other random attributes of a person. And so that's not an informed choice. Like it's, you wouldn't say it's an informed medical choice if someone said, do you want blah, 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 and you didn't know what the hell it was. And then you just had to say yes or no. And you said yes or no based on what it sounded like. Like, no, of course that's not good medicine. And that sounds absurd, but that's often the case in a lot of like judicial elections. And to extend this a bit, it's not just the case in judicial elections, but there's a lot of local positions. California elects people to local area and neighborhood councils, LANCs, but also to like water board conservation districts, fire conservation districts. The average voter does not and should not know what the hell those are.
STL believes in the Vanguard Party at the state level only. Anything above the state level, more democracy, but below the state level, Vanguardism all day, every day.
That's hilarious. One other thing to note is that campaign finance, especially for judges, is particularly insane. That you can have attorneys that are going to be appearing before these courts very frequently, financing the campaign, the successful campaign, whoever becomes judge. That's just like crazy incentives, and I mean, surely produces bias.
Yeah. Well, there you go, guys. I mean, I think that's pretty much it, unless you guys wanted to talk about anything else real quick. Those are our policies that we have sort of not a lot of evidence, or no, there's overwhelming evidence for in some respects, but we are very skeptical of them for one reason or another.